Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What is your haunted house story? Story 1. Skull in the Window.
My childhood home was definitely haunted. I can feel it when there is a presence somewhere. There is a palpable sense of being watched. A tension in the air that lingers and simmers into full-blown terror. It makes you feel vulnerable in ways you cannot explain. When I was a younger child, I remember seeing glowing red eyes hovering in the air of our dark living room. At the time, I thought our house might have had werewolves or vampires. In the 3rd grade, I experienced a phase where glowing orbs would appear in my room, lingering for minutes at a time. My young mind tried to rationalize these occurrences as alien activity. Most places felt fine in the dark, but within our house, I always felt like I was being watched. Whatever it was seemed to harbor either malicious or at best neutral intentions. Paranormal activity escalated in high school, but earlier events set the stage. Between 7th and 8th grade, my cousin Billy stayed at our house while most of my family was away. One night, as he went to bed in what later became known as the spooky room, he saw a figure leave the garage and enter our house. Thinking it was my father, he heard a voice calling, "Billy, Billy, Billy, help me." Startled, he rushed to my father, who was asleep and annoyed by the interruption. Billy returned to bed, only to hear the voice call out again, "Billy, Billy, Billy, help, help, help." This time, my father was equally confused and irritated. Billy chose to sleep on the couch that night. I did not learn about this incident until years later. By high school, I moved into that very room after my brother left for college. One morning, I woke up to find a skull perfectly drawn on the inside layer of dust on the window by my bed. No one had access to the room except me and my parents, who were not the type to pull pranks. I wiped it away after showing my mother. Weeks later, as I was studying in the room at night, I looked at the window, which reflected the room like a mirror. In its reflection, I saw a white silhouette standing behind me. I froze, holding my gaze for what felt like 10 seconds. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there. The reflection had also vanished. I avoided sleeping in the room for several nights. A few weeks later, I saw the same silhouette walking past my window one night. This time, I was lying in bed with the lights off, listening to a late-night radio show. Once again, I avoided the room. Over the months, I noticed more drawings in the dust. Scribbles, shapes, and symbols would appear. Fearful they might hold a sinister meaning, I wiped them away. Out of curiosity, I left a sticky note on the window that read, "Please write below." Days later, I found a perfect circle drawn around the note, resembling the imprint of a paint can. The drawings continued until one stood out so vividly that I recreated it on my computer using Microsoft Paint before wiping it away. Many of my friends and colleagues, when shown the recreation, reached the same eerie conclusion about its meaning. For most of high school, I slept with the lights on, avoiding that side of the house as much as possible. But the most terrifying experience happened during my senior year. One evening, I was in the living room with my mother watching television. When the clothes dryer finished, I reluctantly went to empty it despite the dread I always felt near the spooky room. As I bent down to retrieve the laundry, my mind went completely blank. My arms went limp. Against my will, my body stood upright. At that moment, I heard a deep masculine breath and a hiss directly in my ear. The sensation broke me out of my trance and I regained control of my body. Terrified, I fled the area and avoided that part of the house as much as I could from then on.
Story 2. Footsteps in the dark.
My parents bought a very old house about 10 years ago, and it feels like everyone but me has had a paranormal experience there. They have both claimed to see a short, somewhat chubby, ginger-haired child appearing at random places in the house. Sometimes they would spot him standing silently in the washer and dryer room before vanishing. Other times he appeared at the top of the stairs, only to walk toward my room and then disappear into nothingness. Eventually, my parents grew tired of the unsettling visits and asked my grandfather, a deeply religious man, to come and bless the house. Afterward, the appearances stopped, or so they believed. My brother has recounted late nights when he would hear footsteps creeping up the old squeaky stairs. The sound would stop at his closed door, followed by the doorknob jiggling as if someone were trying to enter. He described the eerie movement of the knob. It would turn slightly, as if teasingly testing the lock, before the footsteps retreated back down the stairs, fading into silence at the bottom. No doors ever opened or closed. It was as though the presence simply disappeared. My mother has also shared her own chilling experiences. Late at night, as she sat watching television, she often noticed something peeking at her from around the corners of the room. She would try to dismiss it as her imagination or a trick of her drowsy mind, but the unnerving feeling lingered. There was a period when the mudroom door would flex and move as though reacting to changes in air pressure. Normally, this happens when someone opens or closes an exterior door, but during these occurrences, every door remained locked and no one was nearby. Despite all of this, I seem to be the only one who has not witnessed anything unexplainable. Perhaps it is because I have spent countless nights alone in the house, attributing the strange noises to my sleep paralysis and vivid night terrors. Yet even now, as I reflect on their stories, I cannot help but feel a shiver at the thought of what might still be lurking in the shadows of our old home.
Story 3. Door that opened itself.
I used to live in a basement apartment when I was in graduate school. The landlady lived in the main house, and although she was a very kind and pleasant person, there was something about her house that always felt off to me. Despite the strange atmosphere, the rent was reasonable, and it was only a short 2 miles from my school, so I decided to stay. A week or two after I moved in, I went to bed one evening, and the apartment was pitch black. The only time I ever heard my landlady was when she wanted to speak to me. I would hear the doors above the stairs unlock, and then she would call out my name. But on this particular night, something was different. I heard movement on the stairs. The sound of heavy footsteps descending the steps reached my ears, but I didn't hear her unlock the door or call out to me. It was around 2 a.m., and I was terrified. The footsteps echoed in the silence of the night, growing closer. I pulled the covers over my head in an attempt to shield myself from whatever was coming. My heart raced as I listened, every footstep getting louder, closer, until I could hear them moving toward my door. The floor creaked under the weight of whoever or whatever was coming. I held my breath, too frightened to move or even open my eyes. And then silence. For a few agonizing seconds, there was no sound. I couldn't tell if it was safe to relax or if the footsteps were about to start again. Then I heard it. The doorknob began to turn slowly, as if someone was trying to open the door. My body froze in terror. I kept my eyes shut, praying silently under the covers, hoping that whatever it was would go away. Before I knew it, the morning light began to filter through the windows, and the terror of that night faded away. I hadn't heard the footsteps again, nor had the door been opened. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew something had been in the house with me. I stayed in that apartment for 2 years. But when graduation came around, I stayed in a hotel for the night, as there was no room for my family to sleep in the apartment. That night in the hotel was the first time in what felt like forever that I had a restful sleep.
Story 4. Unhappy Spirit.
Apart from specters appearing at random intervals, the most chilling experience was the night before Christmas. For background, the spirit in our home had proved to be very possessive of me and kept attempting to keep me from my boyfriend, trying to win my attention, perhaps affection. Every night when he would be working late into the early hours, I would fall asleep in our room with the bedroom door unlocked to grant him easy access. Every night when he got home, the door was firmly locked. I would hear him calling for me from other rooms while he was showering, and would emerge to find the house always empty, with my boyfriend either at the gas station or in the backyard. The spirit would sit next to me on the bed, appear to me while I was bathing, and rap on the wall when I was alone. It always seemed to crave my attention. One night, my then boyfriend was deployed, and I was just starting on a glass of wine, settling onto the living room couch. We had decorated the house right before he left, but I was lonely and hadn't heard from him in a day or two. A few tears slipped down my face, and then I heard a sound. No branch had moved, there was no breeze or fan, but a glass ornament gently dropped from the tree onto the wood floor without breaking. I stared at it as it stayed in place for a second under the tree. Then it slowly rolled 4 feet in my direction, over the lip of the thick, heavy rug, which shouldn't have been possible, and stopped directly in front of my feet. It was the first of many gifts meant to cheer me up. I later received a vintage children's card, a Queen of Spades with torn edges and yellowed paper, shortly after. I don't know where it came from. It appeared one day, and when I would throw it out, it would appear somewhere else: the garage, the windowsill, under the bed. One time, my boyfriend threw it away, as if in angry retaliation. When I was in the bath that evening, the spirit of a woman sat on my chest, pressing me into the water. I couldn't move. It was like a night terror, but with the risk of drowning. She had such a twisted, hateful face. After a moment of clawing at the sides of the tub, I was released. We sold the house earlier this year and moved across the country. We found out that the previous owner had been a depressed, manic hoarder who kept animals she seemingly abused in the home. I don't know what happened to her, or if it's certain that she died in the house, but the spirit that dwelled there was the unhappiest entity I had ever encountered.
Story 5. Creepy video that revealed a dark secret.
When I was growing up, my family moved into a large 2-story house that was built in the early 1890s. We moved in during the mid-1990s, and my dad mentioned that the house was already over 100 years old at that point. It was a fascinating house with a massive backyard, but there were some parts of it that always felt off. The basement, in particular, was dark and unfinished, with 2 small rooms facing each other. One of these rooms had strange wooden dividers on the floor, almost like something you'd see in a horse stable, but on a much smaller scale. It gave off an unsettling vibe, as if something didn't belong there. On the landing, heading to the second floor, there was a door halfway up the wall that led to an attic space. This door wasn't attached, it was just leaning against the door frame. Inside, the attic was covered with old newspaper clippings, and many of the faces in the pictures had their eyes scratched out. It felt like something out of a horror movie, but seeing it in real life was enough to make your skin crawl. The house itself was always creaking, with knocks and bangs echoing throughout. While that was typical for an old house, there were moments that felt too strange to ignore. It never seemed like a haunted house though, at least not until one day when my younger brother and my cousin were making a video. They were using a webcam and Windows Movie Maker, goofing around when something unusual happened. In the video, my brother was adjusting the camera. As soon as his hand left the camera, something moved behind them. It quickly ducked out of sight. My brother didn't notice, but my cousin did, and he immediately turned around to check. There was nothing there. We watched the video over and over, and that's when I saw it too. In the reflection, whatever it was seemed to materialize, appearing like the head of a bat, about the size of a fist. It's the only time I've ever experienced something so unsettling. To this day, I can't explain what that thing was, but I know what I saw.
Story 6. Woman in White.
I spent my childhood in McLean, Virginia, a suburban area near Washington, D.C. The house we lived in was a single story with a large finished basement, and it was an old house, built sometime around the 1990s. My parents, along with my older siblings, moved into it when I was young. My siblings were much older than me, and by the time I was 6, they had all moved out, leaving me to experience the strange happenings in the house on my own. The house had its share of creepy aspects. There was a large basement with a couple of small rooms that always felt cold and uncomfortable. One of these rooms was especially eerie. It had wooden dividers on the floor, making it feel almost like a horse stable, but much smaller. The rest of the basement felt just as unsettling, especially the unfinished parts. But it wasn't just the basement that was strange. There was also a door on the second floor landing that led to a small attic space. The door didn't even have hinges, it was just propped up against the wall. This attic space was covered with old newspaper clippings, most of them showing people with their eyes scratched out. It was the kind of thing you'd see in a horror movie, but seeing it in real life made my skin crawl. Over the years, we would often hear strange noises in the house. Creaks, knocks, and the occasional bang were common, but we rarely saw anything truly unusual. That is until one day when my younger brother and cousin were messing around with a webcam, making a video. They were recording and editing in Windows Movie Maker when my brother moved the camera slightly, and as soon as his hand moved away, something appeared behind them. It ducked out of view so quickly that my brother didn't notice, but my cousin saw it. He turned around, but there was nothing there. We watched the video multiple times, and I noticed that whatever it was appeared to materialize while my brother adjusted the camera. It looked like a small bat-like head, about the size of a fist. That experience was the most unsettling thing that happened to me, but there were other strange occurrences. One of the scariest moments happened right before we were getting ready to move out. I was playing hide and seek with my cousins when I hid in a closet downstairs. I don't remember much, but I do remember feeling as if hands were choking me, pressing around my neck. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor, my cousin standing over me, screaming for help. My parents rushed me to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong. They assumed it was an asthma attack, even though I'd never had asthma before. Years later, when I was a college freshman, my family gathered for Thanksgiving. During dinner, my sister casually mentioned how she'd never been happier than the day she moved out of that haunted house. This was the first time I'd heard anyone in the family acknowledge the strange occurrences. As we shared our experiences, my sister told us about seeing a woman in a white dress in the house. She'd seen the figure multiple times, but the most disturbing instance was when she thought it was our mom, only to find that our mom had been in the kitchen the whole time. I also learned that my dad had had his own strange experience. One day, he was working in the basement and placed his soldering iron on the workbench. When he turned around, it was gone. He searched the basement, convinced it had fallen somewhere dangerous, but it wasn't there. He gave up and bought a new one. Months later, when he opened a closet where they stored Christmas decorations, there was the soldering iron, sitting neatly on top of a box, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Then, the most chilling story came from my dad. Before my siblings and I were born, he had a niece who moved in temporarily. One night she screamed in terror, and when my dad rushed downstairs, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, terrified, but unable to speak about what had happened. She never went back into the basement, and my dad had to pack up her belongings for her. Years later, my sister did some research and discovered that the house had once been owned by a developer who had lost everything during the Great Depression. The contractor who built the house had hung himself in the very house we lived in. It was his ghost that had been haunting the basement, trying to choke me. The lady in white was likely the spirit of the previous owner, maybe even protective, but I'm not sure. The house was eventually torn down in 2009, and a new mansion stands in its place. But even after all these years, I can't help but wonder if the spirits still linger in the area. The house was resold several times after it was rebuilt, with new owners not staying long. I guess some spirits never truly rest.
Story 7. Whispers from Beyond.
My old aunt always complained about the noise coming from the next-door neighbors. According to her, it sounded like they were up and about at 3 a.m., causing a racket. I was skeptical. For one, her hearing was poor, so I doubted she could hear anything clearly. And secondly, the neighbors were a quiet family with 2 small children, so I couldn't imagine them making noise that late at night. But despite my doubts, my aunt's complaints continued. After she passed away, we decided to sell her house. While preparing it for sale, we pulled up the carpet in one of the rooms. To our surprise, we discovered a strange D etched into the wooden floor, a mark that no amount of sanding would remove. It was as though the wood had absorbed the impression over time, and the mark was stubbornly stuck there, almost like a warning. Later, the realtor came to take photos of the house. She was alone at the time, in a room at the back of the house with a large set of windows. She had closed the door behind her to get the perfect shot, but when she tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. It wasn't locked, and there was no logical reason for her to be trapped. She had to call out the window to people on the sidewalk to enter the house through the unlocked front door to let her out. Strangely enough, once they arrived, the door opened easily, as though it had never been a problem. There were other strange occurrences, but they remain unclear in my memory. A few years later, we spoke to the new owners. After a year in the house, they revealed something unsettling. My aunt seemed to have finally stopped haunting them. She was finally happy with them, they said, but the house's unsettling history still lingered.
Story 8. Haunted House.
I grew up in an old house in a quiet town. The house itself had a history. It was built in the early 1900s, and it had been passed down through generations. Despite its charm, there was always something off about it. As a child, I would hear whispers in the middle of the night. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination, but as I got older, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. One evening, I was sitting alone in the living room, reading a book. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from upstairs, heavy and deliberate. My parents were out, and I was alone, so I assumed it was just the house settling. But as the footsteps grew louder, they moved down the stairs closer and closer, until I could almost feel the weight of someone standing just behind me. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. I brushed it off, but over the following days things escalated. One night, while lying in bed, I felt the covers suddenly being tugged off me. I woke up startled, but when I looked around, there was no one there. I thought it might have been a dream, but the sensation was too real to ignore. Things continued to get stranger. I started to find objects out of place. My favorite mug moved from the kitchen to the living room. My books scattered around the floor. I would hear doors creak open, only to find them shut tight when I checked. But the most terrifying incident happened one night when I was staying up late watching television. I clearly saw the shadow of a person moving across the hallway. It wasn't a trick of the light. The figure was solid, tall, and unmistakably human. I rushed to check, but again, no one was there. After doing some research, I learned that the house had once belonged to a woman named Evelyn, who had passed away there many years ago. It seemed she never really left. The activity eventually died down, but the feeling of being watched never truly went away. The house may have been empty, but something was still lingering, keeping its secrets locked away.
Story 9. Whispers in the Attic.
It was the summer of 2012 when I moved into an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The place was charming at first, large, with intricate woodwork and a sprawling yard. The rent was cheap, and the landlord claimed the house had been empty for decades, but that didn't bother me. I was eager for a fresh start after a tough few months. The first night, everything seemed fine, but that's when the sounds started. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible. It was just creaking wood, I told myself. Old houses are like that, right? But soon I started hearing footsteps in the hallways when I was alone, the soft shuffle of someone walking in the next room. I'd check, but no one was there. Still, I shrugged it off. Sleep deprived from work, I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. Then came the whispers. At first they were so faint I wasn't sure if I'd heard them at all. Soft murmurs in the dark, like someone talking just outside the room. But when I tried to listen closer, they would stop. The house felt colder, especially in the hall that led to the attic. The door at the top of the stairs seemed to open on its own, and every time I checked, it would be wide open, as if someone had been up there watching me. One night, while I was lying in bed, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the air. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were surrounding me. I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the hall toward my room. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Then, the handle began to rattle, slowly at first. then faster. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Finally, the door burst open, but no one was there. I ran out of the house that night, terrified and shaken. I didn't return until the next day, determined to find an explanation. But when I checked the attic, there was something I hadn't noticed before. A faded photograph nailed to the wall, a picture of a woman, her eyes blacked out. The landlord couldn't explain the noises or the photo, and to this day, I don't know who or what was in that house, but I've never stayed in an old house like that again.
Story 10. Third floor.
When I was in college, I rented a small apartment in an old building just outside the city center. It was an inexpensive place, perfect for a student like me, and I moved in without thinking twice. But from the first night, something felt off. The apartment was on the third floor, and it had a long, narrow hallway. The first time I walked down that hallway, I felt a cold draft, though the windows were shut. I shrugged it off, blaming the old building for its drafts. But things only got worse from there. That first night, I went to bed exhausted after a long day of classes. I was just drifting to sleep when I heard it. A soft tapping sound like fingernails on wood coming from somewhere in the apartment. I froze, listening intently. It wasn't the pipes or the wind, it was deliberate, rhythmic. I sat up and turned on the light, but the sound stopped immediately. The next day, I spoke to my neighbor, an older woman who lived across the hall. She didn't seem too surprised when I mentioned the tapping. "You're not the first," she said with a grave expression. "This building has a history, you know. People say it's haunted, but no one talks about it much." She then warned me to stay away from the attic. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. It wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was coming from the ceiling, as if something was walking around above me. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the old building settling. But the noises escalated. I began hearing faint whispers in the hallway late at night. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving across the walls when I knew no one was there. But the worst was when I woke up one morning to find my kitchen cabinet doors wide open. I was sure I had closed them the night before, but I couldn't remember if I had. On the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up to the attic, determined to get to the bottom of whatever was haunting me. The door was old and creaked as I pushed it open. The attic was dark, dusty, filled with old furniture and forgotten items. I walked deeper inside, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off forgotten objects, and then I saw it, a figure, tall, dark, and out of place, standing in the corner. It was a woman, dressed in a long, tattered gown, her face obscured by her hair. I froze, unable to move. The woman's head snapped toward me, and her eyes, cold and empty, stared into mine. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. The whispering intensified, louder, as if the walls themselves were speaking. The woman's voice joined in, faint at first but growing clearer. "Leave now." I bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. The next day, I packed up and left. I couldn't stay there another night. The building was old, but that wasn't the cause of the horror. I was sure of it. When I told the landlord I was moving out, he didn't seem surprised. He just handed me my deposit back and whispered, "No one stays for long."
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.